Okay, so we're live.
Okay, shall I kick off?
Yes, please.
Okay, so hi everyone, and thanks to Mark for organising today's meeting, and thanks for the earlier talks. They're really interesting. And I should say on record, thanks to all those universities for sharing materials that we've used at Lancaster for the development of our courses. Some fantastic materials out there, and we hope to get ours into a more public form very soon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience, like others have, of teaching at Lancaster over the last couple of years. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the way we've adopted the RStudio Server and how that's gone in terms of the challenges and in terms of the benefits as well. So Lancaster now, R is the only stats software we teach. So in terms of postgraduate teaching, that's been the case since 2013, largely thanks to Rob Davies, who's been teaching the master's courses there with R for many years. And in terms of the undergraduate program, we moved over to R with our intake in 2020. So like Andy described before, we've sort of done it a year at a time. So our first years in 2020 coming in started learning R, and we've now had 2 years go through that process. So we've got our third years coming in this year who are going to be doing their dissertations with R. I think it was Helena saying in the previous talk, we took it as an opportunity to revamp our stats teaching, our approach, and we've got a significant focus now on data handling, particularly visualization of data, and that forms a much larger component of what we try and get across to students, getting more hands-on with the data, not being scared to sort of deal with data, visualize it, understand what's going on. And we also have adopted the Tidyverse set of packages as our sort of base for teaching R. And we see the inferential stats, which was like the major part of what we were teaching them in terms of the technical bits of doing statistics. We see that now as more, one part of the overall analysis pipeline, largely the sort of final bit. Once you've wrangled your data, visualized it, understood it, summarized it, and so on, you then get to that final bit of doing your inferential statistics. So that's been the major change for us. Just a little bit on the type of department that we are now. This was a survey I did, I don't know now, probably in the last 6 months or so, looking at people across the department, what sort of stats packages they continue to use. This isn't just teaching. This is primarily asking about their research. And you can see that the R use in green here is the dominant package that people do use, although lots of people in the department are still using SPSS and Excel for different types of tasks that they're doing. Primarily for sort of inferential stats, SPSS is still kicking about as the thing that people use. One interesting thing about this, if you split the data down into who that is that's answering, SPSS and R, actually, and this is true across all those different types of data analysis that people are doing, it's our PhD students and our postdocs that are driving us towards more R use in the department, and it's us old dinosaurs that are using SPSS. And, I guess people who don't have so much time to sort of spend hours and hours learning R. So it's great that we've got this sort of younger cohort of researchers coming through who are favoring R. So now on to sort of, how our teaching works here. One thing to say is that our teaching space, we have this large teaching space, large classroom designed for methods teaching and stats teaching. It's fairly large capacity. We take on around 220 students each year. So they're normally split across about 4 lab classes. And we've redesigned this space so that it's a bit more sort of open, and students, it's meant to be sort of more collaborative. Students sit around desks in sort of groups of 4 or 5 and work together on the tasks that we set them. So they're not sort of sat there individually or in pairs at a computer. And one of the reasons for that is that students were coming along to our stats classes with their own devices. And we found that having a load of, Macs in our case, set up in the room, students were actually just getting their laptops out and opening their laptops whilst having a PC in front of them or a Mac in front of them. And they were getting tablets out and they were getting phones out. So actually we redesigned the room to sort of try and build it around students' own devices being brought into sessions. We also have a laptop loaning system, so students, if they don't come with a laptop, they can loan one out. So yeah, we have this setup of students bringing in their own devices. Students can loan out a laptop, those are all PCs. And when we started this in 2020, in terms of moving over to R, we're thinking about how we deliver R, how we get people to use R. And we had 2 choices for how to go. So we could have gone the Glasgow route, which was described earlier, which is to have students download R and RStudio onto their device, and obviously provide instruction on how to do that, and let them get on with it, and then deal with the issues as they crop up. And we sort of debated this for quite a while, whether we go down that route. Obviously that's free, but for us, we could foresee there being many issues potentially with that option. It'd be interesting to hear what Glasgow say about the issues that they face there. So whereas for someone like myself, who's done this sort of thing before, installing R and RStudio is fairly straightforward. We guess that for a lot of our first-year psych students, this would be a reasonably daunting process, and it might take several hours to do. They might run into all sorts of issues. We obviously would be wondering whether the students would be keeping their R and their packages in particular up to date. And we'd obviously then be faced with all sorts of different incompatibilities across our students, whether there be device-specific problems they'd be coming in with. And certainly the approach of our ISS support in the university is that they have a way of delivering software to students. They don't tend to deal with individual bits of software that students have downloaded to their devices. So we didn't want to have to deal with all these sort of device-specific, operating system-specific issues that potentially we could envisage happening with allowing them to download themselves. And as I say, one thing is keeping packages up to date and dealing with any package conflicts if we are asking students to install all the packages themselves. The other option we had was to have students use the university software delivery system. So we have a thing called Apps Anywhere, which the university uses to serve software to staff and to students. So you can go onto a web page, you get a presentation of all these 200 odd bits of software that you can stick onto your device, and that's paged through this cloud paging system, and it delivers the software to your device. Okay. That works surprisingly. It sounds a bit rubbish, but that actually works surprisingly well for PCs. Unfortunately, it doesn't work at all, at least here at Lancaster, it doesn't work at all for Macs and Chromebooks. So I then decided, with neither of these options being particularly great from what we could tell, I sort of went to our ISS about this and said, well, what should I can do? They said, well, use Apps Anywhere, but have them use the virtual desktop infrastructure, and have them boot into a virtual desktop in their browser, and then they can just use Apps Anywhere like they could if they were using a PC. Oh, that sounds great, I said. So I thought this would be the solution. This would be no problem at all. And then everybody would be using the Apps Anywhere version. We'd have consistency across all our students, and everything would be hunky-dory. In actual fact, this was the perfect storm in terms of we were faced with this perfect storm of sort of factors in 2020. And as mentioned before, of course, we have first-year psych students coming in a pandemic. So we were given specific instructions in our lab classes, which we were running in person for our stats classes in year 1, don't come anywhere near me, you've got to stay away. We deal with things, remotely, even though you're in the same room as me, and so on, which didn't work well at all. We told students, you're about to do some coding, but by the way, you can't use that shiny new Mac that you brought along to your session that your parents had just bought you for university. Now what you need to do is use your Mac to get onto a browser and access this virtual desktop thing. So actually, you're going to be using a Windows device when that boots up in the virtual desktop. Then what we want you to do is cloud page the RStudio software. And now, if you could, once you've got that RStudio loaded up, if you could then now download the data and the scripts that you need for your stats lab, and then put those into RStudio. And this is where it all went terribly wrong, because telling students that they have to download the lab data and the scripts, and then misinterpreting that they have to then download that to their shiny new Mac and not the virtual desktop that they're working in. So we're saying, no, don't do it on your device, actually do it on the virtual desktop. And for many of our students, this was like staring into the matrix and sort of trying to figure out what on earth was going on. And I had many sessions with students trying to explain exactly how this was meant to work, and they found it, quite frankly, confusing and ridiculous, and I don't terribly blame them really for thinking that. So in terms of how it went that first term in the pandemic, teaching R to our first year undergraduates, I think it's probably summed up by these three gifts here. It was fairly horrendous for us and for the students. A favorite quote of mine from the student evaluations was, "I didn't choose to do psychology to be a hardcore programmer." And so one thing to say, though, that's interesting about that term, it was a bit of a shocker, and we learned an awful lot from doing it. But one thing to say is that actually students, from our measurement, didn't actually do too bad with the R content. So here's some data from a class test that I ran just before Christmas, at the end of that first term. And in blue here, we've got the RStudio questions that I asked them. So I just had a few RStudio questions, or R questions about, here's some code, tell me what this code would do, or if I wanted to produce this graph, which of these 4 lines of code would actually produce that graph? And some of these questions were reasonably tricky, but the students actually did remarkably well, much better than many of the conceptual questions that we're asking them about statistics. So I think there's an important message there that I sort of took away at that point, that you can't pay too much attention to the sort of initial reactions of students to doing this sort of thing, to experiencing R coding and learning their statistics through R. They used to hate doing it in SPSS. They now also are fearful and very anxious about doing it in R. But actually, in many cases, at least in our hands, and quite clearly at the other universities as well, they actually do really well, and they're picking up fantastic skills doing this. So when it got to the end of the year, and we sort of muddled through it in the pandemic, as everybody did, we decided to change things, because it was pretty much a disaster from a technical point of view of delivering RStudio, certainly to those Mac users and Chromebook users. And we looked into, on the advice of Plymouth, who'd been using it for a couple of years, I think, we looked into setting up an RStudio Server. So RStudio Server is a version of RStudio that runs on server hardware that can deliver an RStudio experience to users through a web browser. And it's completely free to actually download the server software and install it on your own server. And for academic departments like your own that are teaching stats, as long as you provide a module description that shows the R content that's in your module, then you can also get the sort of pro version of the software as well. So when students go to the address, our address is here, sci-rstudio.lancaster.ac.uk, and students can access this, in our case, on the university network or through a VPN So they need to be connected to the university network, in our case, to access it. And that's not too much of a problem for us. They're faced with this dialog box, they enter their username and password, and then what happens is it logs into an RStudio session. And as you can see, it looks identical to the RStudio that you're all familiar with, that you have on your own machines. So the RStudio experience in the browser is pretty much identical to the RStudio experience locally. There are a couple of differences, but they're pretty minor. It's very responsive. It works extremely well. And as you'll see, I highly recommend checking it out. So in terms of the positives about the experience of RStudio Server, obviously we're now, because it's a centralized version of R and RStudio, we're in control of the updates to R, the updates to the packages, the installs of the packages. We never actually tell our students how to install packages at any point during their first 2 years with R. So all the packages that they need are requested by staff. We install those ideally before term starts, so everything is, and we keep everything up to date. And you can actually disable the sort of GUI version of installing the package in RStudio. Obviously, everyone is then on the same version of things. Everyone's on the same version of R, the same version of the packages, and we if there's conflicts between packages, we know about it in terms of if one person's seeing that conflict, then everybody else will be seeing it as well. It doesn't matter whether you're on a Mac, a PC, Linux machine, Chromebook, whatever, even a tablet or anything, as long as you've got a reasonably modern browser, i.e. something in the last, I think, like 10 years or so, you can use the RStudio server through the browser. And obviously that means it's device independent in terms of the student experience. So they can use one of our loan laptops, work on the server in the class, go home, use it at their parents' house or whatever, come on campus in their bedroom, they can be using it on a different computer, and they're just logging in. So none of the files and none of the work that they're doing is on that local device. As I say, consistent experience across our users. And also one of the nice things I'll talk about in a little bit is the project sharing feature of the RStudio server. In terms of negatives, I'm not really quite sure whether this first one is a negative, but one thing that is the server is not linked to any of the drives on your computer, so you're obviously not going to see an explorer view of your files on your computer. Anything you're working with needs to be imported or uploaded onto the server. Actually, the way that works is really, really nice, especially for teaching purposes. So for each week, we would make a zip file available of the data, the scripts that the students needed, and anything else they might need for the lab session. We'd have that zip available. Students would access that and upload it into their space on the server, and it automatically unpacks that into a folder for them to use in their session. So it's just a sort of different way of working with data and scripts. And obviously, if students wanted to then bring the work that they've done out of the server, they would need to export it to their local drives. But for the way that we teach and the way that we work with data and scripts for our teaching, that works just fine. It works really nicely, actually. Obviously, the major negative is that someone's got to set this up and do the admin work for it. In our case, that was me initially, and with some help from some others eventually. So I'll just talk a little bit about the experience of doing that myself over last summer. So after the teaching session, after this seminar session that we ran last year, Andy had given his talk and talked about the RStudio server and how great that was, and I decided that I would make an attempt to get this set up here at Lancaster. So that started with me contacting ISS and saying, would you be able to set me up with an RStudio server, something like that? And the way they interpreted that was give him some virtual server space and let him get on with it himself. And that there was as there often is with the IT, there was a slight sort of miscommunication issue there, and I was left on day one with basically just a virtual server, and they were expecting me to get on with it, which was actually fine in the end, but it was a bit of a sort of a wake-up call to what I was going to need to do. So step one was literally install the operating system on the server. And then step two, install the RStudio Server software itself. Now that might sound like two big jobs, but actually that took about an hour to do. So RStudio Server runs on Ubuntu, a form of Linux, obviously all freely available. And I found it, you know, as someone who's never used Linux before, I found it pretty easy to just follow some guides and get a little bit of advice from IT to actually get started. And within, I say, about an hour, maybe two, of ISS giving me the server space, I had a functioning RStudio server. And to the extent that I was able to add someone else as a user and get them to log on to the server. So that process of adding users to the Linux server is really, really easy. Literally just one line of code, type in a password, go and tell that person that they've got an account with a password. Obviously, the fun starts when you get to large numbers, when we have about 220 students coming in. So when we got the server sort of basically functioning, it was a case of, right, okay, let's get the usernames of all our students and make some accounts for them so that they can log in. Now, thankfully, we were really fortunate that Plymouth had gone through that process before, and Ben Wiley at Plymouth had done a lot of the hard work and basically has made his scripts available for people to use. So Ben's got these scripts, I've adapted the scripts for our need, and you can email me for them. I need to do a bit of tidying up to make them secure and available for people to use online. But these scripts will basically do the major job of adding users and generate that code that you need to put into your server to do a batch job to add hundreds of users at a time. That wasn't that difficult to do, really, in the end, as I say, because Ben had made it easy. So to a certain extent, there's a process, or there was at least at Lancaster here, because nobody was sort of ISS. We're very short-staffed in our IT at the moment, and nobody was willing to sort of do this work for me. There was, to a certain extent, a fair few hours doing bits of work on this Linux server to get this up and running. My philosophy with this sort of thing is I learned enough, as people have pointed out with the R stuff, by Googling stuff and finding answers and working through things logically. And I did enough to get by and get this thing up and running. Potentially, I do worry at time to time that I know just about enough to be dangerous and do something stupid, but my IT department ensures me that there's very little I can do to bring down the university network in a ball of flames. There's a few core tasks that you basically need to figure out. And as I say, we've done it, Plymouth have done it. Ask us for advice if you think this is a route you want to go down. Adding and deleting users is a major part of the work. Creating groups, so I have groups for students, groups for staff, ideally groups for different year groups and things like that. There's a bit of installing software on the server and keeping that up to date, installing the R software, keeping that up to date, installing packages and so forth. And certainly in that first term, monitoring performance as to how it was going when our teaching sessions kicked off, and just checking things were working okay. And I would say at this point, a year on, I know slightly more Linux than nothing at all. I am by no means a Linux nerd or an expert. I've basically learned enough along the way to get this thing going. And and so in terms of how did it work, I won't lie to you, it was a little bit stressful at times over the summer, probably because I started a little bit late. And there was, leading up to term time, as there always is, a little bit of stress, but in particular, I was stressing out about the whole thing just collapsing and it being a disaster, because I'd obviously told the department that, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. This is going to work. It's going to be great. It's going to be much better than we had last year. So then I started stressing out about it falling over. And on day one, I'm pretty sure, it's all a bit of a blur now, but I'm pretty sure it didn't fall over on day one. We had a few teething issues with logging in, and our IT department were on hand to, I had them on basically on a call in the first morning, first session, and I said to them, look, it seems to be struggling a little bit, and they quickly gave me another CPU, they gave me some more RAM, and everything seemed to smooth out a little bit then. We did experience some odd browser incompatibility with uploading data and things. That was really just a case of, okay, you're doing it in Safari, try it in Chrome, or you're doing it in Chrome, try it in Safari. Changing browser seemed to solve that entirely, and we had very few issues with that once students had worked out which browser was working well on their machine. So some weird browser incompatibility issues, it happened in probably about 1 or 2% of students. In terms of what I do, or myself and one of our technical team in psychology now does, so I should say that the technical team, we only have a couple of guys here in our technical services team in psychology. Neither of them are Linux experts. I realized I'm slightly over time here, so I'm getting to the end mark. Neither of them are Linux experts, so they were learning with me. And 2 of us now sort of keep an eye on the server. So users forget passwords from time to time. Students forget passwords. We don't have a secure system in the sense that we don't create new passwords for them. There's nothing confidential being stored on the server. We just send out the password that they've been generated earlier on. We look it up and we send it back out to them. We do have sessions getting stuck from time to time. We need to do updates to R and all these sorts of things. But come term 2 and summer term now, we can leave this thing running for weeks, if not months at a time, without really paying any attention to it, and it just works. Mainly because we've got a few CPUs running and plenty of RAM on the system, and even if things do get stuck with our sessions, it's not really too much of a problem. As I say, the pro version, what they call Workbench now, is freely available to academic departments that are doing R. It allows you to monitor the server performance. It allows you to see the sessions that are going on. It's just got a few more bells and whistles. You don't need it, but it's free and it's worth asking for a license for that. Or you can get geeky and look at the Linux processes and all that business. Was it worth it? 100%. It was definitely worth doing. It was far, far better than our experience using our app delivery system that we'd used in the previous year. I won't go through these data here. This was a survey I did of second-year students who'd experienced that terrible system in the first year. We knew that the R server was going well, so I just wanted to gloat with the fact that this was going well, and they did their job of telling me that they much preferred the RStudio Server to what they were using last year. And there's a couple of quotes from Mac users who were saying it's quite frankly ridiculous what we had last year. This is far better. One of the nice things, I've just mentioned this, one of the nice things is the project sharing that you can do on the RStudio Server. So I've got a couple of undergraduates working with me at the moment, or have been working with me on a project doing some data collection, and we've set up a project on the RStudio Server. I added them as users to that project. We can then collaborate on the scripts. We can even follow each other's coding in real time if you want to do that. But the way that it's a really easy way to share and collaborate on analysis projects with students, with other researchers. And so I think this could be potentially really useful for dissertation supervision. So just a few final slides. What do I recommend? Get started early, obviously. Assuming your IT will not just set this up and administrate it for you, can they allocate you some server space to do this? I know that Plymouth will refuse that, and they have rented their server space. Andy will probably put a note in the chat about how much that actually costs them, or roughly how much that costs them per year to do that. One thing I would say, though, is that it can get quite technical at times. It's very useful to have somebody in your IT department who is a Linux expert, and someone who is nice enough to provide that little bit of Linux support when things get a little bit challenging. So we had You know, we had a few of these occasions over the year. One of them was we had to migrate from one disk to another disk. That wasn't something I was going to take on myself. And our Linux expert in IT stepped in and did a great job of doing that for me. So once we got him on board and he saw that we were basically handling it ourselves, but he just needed to drop in and offer some technical support, things were really, really stress-free and smooth to run. One of the major tasks is setting up the account, to log in. And we're looking this summer to setting ours up with the single sign-on system at the university. If we can get the university to agree to that and we can set it up, then that takes out a huge job each summer of adding new users onto the system and obviously deleting old users. So ideally, we're going to get that set up this summer. So yeah, start early, but it is definitely worth doing. And as I say, Lancaster and Plymouth have done this, and we're here to help. We've got things available for you to use. All right, thank you. Sorry, I went a bit over, Mark.
Yeah, no problem. So I think maybe we will just hold questions for you, Tom, until later in the discussion. There was quite a bit of chat during your talk, and some of those were questions for you, and I would imagine other people have questions for you as well. I do. I'm one of them. So maybe we will just leave it all until the end.
I'll try and answer any specific things. I'll try and answer them in the chat now if I can.
Yeah. So if people want to get Tom's attention and ask a question, maybe you can just make that clear in your message. That it's specifically for Tom. And likewise, I suppose in general with the chat, if you have a question for the speaker during the talk, if you can just indicate that it is a question for the speaker rather than a question for others to comment on during the talk, that would be helpful. Okay, I should stop the recording now.